His wife got a $33 million business deal and threw him out to marry her lover, unaware he owned the trillion-dollar company that signed the deal. What he did shocked her and left her ruined. Rebecca Hart stood in the marble lobby of her struggling marketing firm, holding the contract that would change everything, but as she signed the papers that morning, she had no idea the deal came from her husband's empire, the same husband she was about to discard like yesterday's trash. Daniel Wright had spent 12 years playing the role of the underachieving spouse, watching his ambitious wife claw her way up through the business world while he pretended to be just another failed entrepreneur working from their guest room. But the truth was far more devastating. Every boardroom, every corporate tower, every billion-dollar merger Rebecca had ever admired was connected to the man she now considered beneath her. The moment Rebecca told Daniel to pack his things so Christopher Kane could move into their bedroom, she sealed her fate. But she didn't know the lover she'd chosen over her marriage was actually Daniel's employee, planted specifically to test whether the woman he'd loved would stay loyal when temptation appeared. As Rebecca threw her wedding ring on the kitchen counter and declared herself free from the man who'd supposedly wasted her time, Daniel made a single phone call that would transform her triumph into her nightmare, but the shock of what he unleashed wouldn't just destroy Rebecca's new relationship. Would Rebecca recognize her mistake before the empire she'd just signed with crushed her completely? Or would her betrayal become the cautionary tale that destroyed everything she'd worked to achieve? The contract felt heavy in Rebecca Hart's hands, but not because of the paper's weight. It was the gravity of $33 million pressing against her consciousness, the validation she'd chased for 7 brutal years, finally materializing in corporate letterhead and legal binding signatures. She stood alone in her firm's conference room at 6 in the morning, watching dawn break over Manhattan's skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, but her mind wasn't on the beauty of the moment. It was calculating how quickly she could remove the dead weight dragging down her life. Daniel would need to be gone by tonight, but that seemed like a small price to pay for the freedom she'd earned, the future she deserved, the life Christopher Kane promised her when he'd whispered about second chances during their late-night strategy sessions. The irony was that Daniel had been sleeping in that same building's penthouse suite when Rebecca signed the papers, but he wasn't asleep. He was watching through secure feeds, observing his wife's face as she betrayed him with ink and ambition, measuring the depth of her disloyalty with the precision he'd brought to building his empire. 12 years earlier, Daniel Wright had made a decision that would define this moment. But back then he'd been optimistic, foolish even, believing that genuine love could exist without the corruption of wealth and power. He'd met Rebecca at a charity fundraiser where she'd been serving drinks to pay her way through business school, but he hadn't approached her as Daniel Wright, the man whose grandfather had built Wright Global Enterprises into a trillion-dollar colossus. He'd approached her as Danny, a consultant with dreams bigger than his bank account, a nobody with ambition but no connections. Their courtship had been beautifully ordinary, but that ordinariness was carefully constructed, meticulously maintained through shell companies and trusted intermediaries who ensured Rebecca never connected her struggling boyfriend to the corporate giant whose buildings dominated her commute. Daniel had wanted to know if someone could love him for who he was beneath the empire, but now, watching Rebecca celebrate a contract his own company had issued, he understood he'd been testing the wrong hypothesis. The question wasn't whether Rebecca could love a poor man, but whether she could remain loyal when temptation wore an expensive suit and promised everything her husband supposedly couldn't provide. Christopher Kane had been Daniel's most trusted acquisition specialist before becoming his most valuable spy, but Christopher didn't know he was a spy. He believed he was genuinely courting Rebecca Hart, genuinely offering her the deal that would save her failing marketing firm, genuinely building a relationship that would replace her disappointing marriage. Daniel had selected Christopher specifically because the man was everything Daniel pretended not to be. Charismatic, obviously wealthy, openly ambitious, and completely confident in his own importance. But Christopher was also completely unaware that his employment, his authority, his ability to sign $33 million contracts all flowed from the man whose wife he was currently seducing. The affair had started 6 months ago at an industry conference in Miami, but Daniel had orchestrated the meeting down to the hotel room assignments, ensuring Rebecca and Christopher would end up at the same networking dinner, seated at the same table, discovering they had complementary business philosophies and undeniable chemistry. Rebecca had come home from that conference different, but not guilty. She'd been energized, excited, talking about a potential client who understood her vision in ways Daniel supposedly never could. And Daniel had listened patiently, playing the role of the supportive but unremarkable husband who was simply glad to see his wife happy. The next 3 months had been a masterclass in controlled observation, but Daniel hadn't enjoyed watching his wife fall for another man. Every late-night text message, every unexplained business dinner, every moment Rebecca chose Christopher over their marriage had carved deeper wounds into Daniel's heart, yet he'd forced himself to remain passive, to play the fool, to see exactly how far his wife would go. The answer had arrived this morning in the form of divorce papers, served alongside the business contract. But Rebecca had been thoughtful enough to schedule them simultaneously, apparently believing that financial success would soften the blow of marital abandonment. Daniel walked through the empty corridors of Wright Global Enterprises headquarters, but this building didn't bear his name publicly. It was officially owned by a subsidiary of a subsidiary, one of 17 layers separating Daniel Wright, the anonymous husband, from the corporate entity that controlled approximately 1/8 of the world's commercial real estate. His office occupied the entire 97th floor, but he rarely used it, preferring to work from the guest room in his home, maintaining the fiction that he was still trying to make his consulting business work, still struggling to match his wife's success, still the disappointment she increasingly believed him to be. The phone on his desk had been silent for 12 years, but this morning it would ring, and when it did, the carefully constructed fiction of Rebecca's triumph would begin its collapse. Daniel checked his watch. Rebecca would be heading home now, practicing the speech she'd deliver, the kind but firm explanation of why their marriage had run its course, why Christopher represented her future while Daniel embodied her past. But she didn't know that every word she planned to say had been anticipated, calculated, and countered weeks in advance. Rebecca's marketing firm, Hart Creative Solutions, occupied a modest office in Chelsea, but its modest appearance concealed debts that would have crushed the company within 60 days, debts that existed because Daniel had quietly purchased Rebecca's outstanding loans through intermediary companies, then deliberately called them due, manufacturing the crisis that would make her desperate enough to accept Christopher's deal. The $33 million contract wasn't just a business arrangement, but a noose disguised as a lifeline, structured with clauses that gave Wright Global Enterprises complete control over Hart Creative's operations, assets, and future earnings, effectively making Rebecca an employee of her husband's empire while she believed she'd finally achieved independence. The morning traffic was light as Rebecca drove back to their brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, but her mind was racing faster than the cars around her, rehearsing conversations, anticipating Daniel's reactions, planning how she'd pack his belongings while maintaining some semblance of dignity. She'd already arranged for Christopher to pick her up at 8 o'clock. They were going to celebrate at Per Se, the restaurant where Daniel had proposed 12 years ago, but Rebecca didn't see the symbolism as cruel, just convenient, a nice full-circle moment that would mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Daniel was sitting in the kitchen when Rebecca arrived, but he wasn't eating or reading or doing anything that might suggest normalcy. He was simply sitting, hands folded on the table, waiting with the patience of someone who knew exactly what was coming. Rebecca hesitated in the doorway, but then her resolve hardened, her hand reaching into her purse to retrieve the divorce papers her attorney had prepared, her voice steady as she began the speech she'd practiced. "Daniel, we need to talk about our future," Rebecca said, but there was no future in her tone, only the past tense of failed expectations and mutual disappointment. "I think we both know this hasn't been working for a long time." Daniel nodded slowly, but he didn't speak, didn't interrupt, didn't give Rebecca the argument she'd half expected, and his silence was more unsettling than anger would have been. Rebecca pressed forward, but her confidence wavered slightly, thrown off by her husband's strange calm. "I've met someone who understands my ambitions, my drive," Rebecca continued, but she couldn't quite meet Daniel's eyes, couldn't face the quiet judgment in his gaze. "Christopher Kane has offered me opportunities you've never been able to provide, and I think it's time we both admitted that we want different things from life." The name hung in the air between them, but Daniel's expression didn't change, didn't register the surprise or hurt Rebecca had expected, and his lack of reaction made her increasingly uncomfortable, made her wonder if perhaps he'd known about the affair longer than she'd realized. Rebecca placed the divorce papers on the table, but Daniel didn't reach for them, didn't even look at them, just kept his eyes fixed on his wife's face with an intensity that made her want to flee. "I've also secured a major contract today," Rebecca added, but now her words sounded defensive, as if she were justifying her decisions rather than simply stating facts. $33 million from Wright Global Enterprises. This deal will change everything for my company, for my future." Something flickered across Daniel's face at the mention of his company's name, but it was gone before Rebecca could identify it. Amusement, perhaps, or maybe just profound sadness at how completely his wife had missed the truth. Daniel finally spoke, but his voice was quiet, controlled, carrying none of the emotion Rebecca had braced herself to handle. "I'm happy for your success, Rebecca," Daniel said, but there was something in his tone that made the words sound less like congratulations and more like a eulogy. "You've worked hard for this moment. You deserve to enjoy it." Rebecca blinked, but Daniel's easy acceptance was more disturbing than resistance would have been. She'd prepared for arguments, for pleading, for the desperate negotiations of a man trying to save his marriage. But Daniel seemed almost relieved, almost grateful to be released from their relationship. Rebecca felt her certainty wavering, but she pushed the feeling aside, attributing it to guilt rather than intuition, refusing to second-guess the decision that had taken months to finalize. "I'll need you to move out today," Rebecca said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier firmness, betraying the discomfort Daniel's strange reaction had created. "Christopher is helping me celebrate tonight, and I think it would be better if you weren't here." Daniel stood slowly, but he didn't move toward the door. Instead, he walked to the window overlooking their small garden, the space where they'd planted tomatoes 3 summers ago, where they'd kissed under fairy lights during their 5th anniversary party, where all the small, beautiful moments of their marriage had accumulated into a history that was about to be erased. When Daniel turned back to face Rebecca, something had shifted in his demeanor, but it wasn't anger or heartbreak. It was decision, finality, the look of a man who just closed a particularly difficult negotiation. "Before I go, I want to give you something," Daniel said, but he pulled out his phone rather than retrieving a physical object, his fingers moving across the screen with the casual efficiency of someone performing a routine task. "Consider it a wedding gift for your new marriage." Rebecca frowned, but before she could ask what he meant, her own phone began vibrating violently in her purse, notification after notification flooding her screen with an urgency that made her stomach clench with undefined dread. She pulled out the device, but the messages filling her screen didn't make immediate sense. Alerts from her company's bank accounts, emails from her board of directors, text messages from her assistant that simply read, "Call me now," in increasingly frantic capital letters. Daniel watched his wife's face drain of color, but he felt no satisfaction in her panic. This moment represented the death of his last hope, the final confirmation that the woman he'd loved had never existed outside his imagination. Rebecca's fingers trembled as she opened the email from her bank, but the words on the screen seemed impossible, nonsensical, a mistake that would surely be corrected once she made the right phone calls. The $33 million contract had been revoked, but that was just the beginning. Wright Global Enterprises was exercising Clause 17, subsection B of the agreement Rebecca had signed that morning, a clause that gave the company complete authority to recall all payments, seize all assets provided under the contract, and demand immediate repayment of any funds already transferred. Rebecca's company bank accounts had been frozen, but worse than frozen, they'd been emptied. Every dollar transferred back to Wright Global with the efficiency of a surgical strike. "What is this?" Rebecca whispered, but she already knew the answer was catastrophic, could feel her carefully constructed future disintegrating in real time. "This can't be legal," Christopher said. "Christopher Kane is an employee," Daniel interrupted, but his voice remained maddeningly calm, explaining rather than gloating. "He's a very good employee, actually. Excellent at identifying targets, at building relationships, at making people believe they're getting exactly what they want. But he doesn't have the authority to sign contracts on behalf of Wright Global Enterprises. That authority belongs to exactly one person." Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth, but the gesture couldn't contain the gasp of realization that escaped, couldn't stop the horrifying understanding that was crashing over her like a tsunami of consequences. Her eyes lifted from her phone to her husband's face, but Daniel looked different now, not defeated, not unremarkable, not the failure she'd been so eager to discard, but something else entirely, something that had been hidden in plain sight for 12 years. "The consulting business you thought I was failing at," Daniel continued, but each word landed like a hammer blow, shattering Rebecca's reality into unrepairable fragments, was never real. The guest room office, the long hours, the modest income, all of it was theater, a role I played because I wanted to know if you could love me without the empire. Rebecca backed away from Daniel, but she had nowhere to go in her own kitchen, no escape from the truth that was rewriting every memory, every assumption, every moment of her marriage into something unrecognizable. Her mind raced through 12 years of conversations, but now they all seemed different, colored by the revelation that she'd been living with someone she'd never actually known. "You're not," Rebecca started, but she couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the impossibility that was becoming increasingly undeniable. Wright Global Enterprises is worth $1.3 trillion approximately, Daniel confirmed, but he delivered the figure with the same casual tone someone might use to mention the weather, as if discussing unfathomable wealth was perfectly ordinary. Though the number fluctuates based on market conditions, currency exchanges, and the quarterly performance of our subsidiaries across 47 countries. Rebecca's legs buckled, but she caught herself on the kitchen counter, her successful morning transforming into a nightmare that made no sense, that violated everything she'd believed about her life, her choices, her understanding of reality. The divorce papers sat on the table between them, but they seemed almost comical now. A woman divorcing a $1 trillion empire while believing she was escaping a failed consultant. "Christopher," Rebecca breathed, but she was grasping for any anchor in the storm, any piece of her new life that might still be real. "He loves me. He wouldn't—" "Christopher Kane believes he's in love with you," Daniel said, but there was genuine sympathy in his voice now, sadness for all the casualties his test had created. "I didn't tell him to seduce you. I didn't order him to build a relationship or make promises about your future together. I simply put you in the same room and watched what happened naturally. and what happened told me everything I needed to know about both of you. The cruelty of it landed like a physical blow, but Rebecca realized it wasn't actually cruelty. It was something colder, more precise, the methodical elimination of variables in an experiment designed to measure loyalty. She thought about all the romantic moments with Christopher, but now they seemed staged, manipulated, the product of circumstances that had been carefully engineered by the husband she'd been planning to abandon. "Why?" Rebecca demanded, but her voice broke on the word, anger and devastation warring for dominance in her tone. "If you're really who you claim to be, why marry me at all? Why not just find someone who already knew your worth?" "Because I wanted to know if love could exist without corruption," Daniel answered, but for the first time his composure cracked slightly, revealing the hurt beneath his calculated revenge. "My grandfather built this empire, but it destroyed every genuine relationship he ever had. Everyone wanted something from him. Everyone saw the money before they saw the man. I thought if I could be loved as Daniel Wright the nobody, it would prove that real connection was possible. But you've shown me I was wrong." Rebecca's anger surged, but it was tangled with guilt, confusion, the horrible realization that she'd failed a test she never knew she was taking, that her husband had been judging her for 12 years while she'd been judging him. The unfairness of it burned through her chest, but underneath the anger was something worse, the creeping suspicion that maybe Daniel's test had revealed something true about her character, something she didn't want to acknowledge. "You lied to me for 12 years, Rebecca spat, but her accusation sounded weak even to her own ears, undermined by the fact that she'd been preparing to leave him for a man she'd known 6 months. "You manipulated me, tested me like I was some kind of experiment." "I gave you 12 years to love me for who I actually am," Daniel countered, but his voice hardened now, the calm facade cracking to reveal the anger underneath. 12 years where I was faithful, supportive, present in ways that had nothing to do with money or power, and the moment someone offered you a bigger prize, you threw me away like I was garbage. So tell me, Rebecca, who really failed this marriage? The question hung between them, but Rebecca had no answer that wouldn't confirm her guilt, no defense that wouldn't sound like the rationalization it was. Her phone continued buzzing with notifications, but each new message brought fresh disaster. Her business partners demanding explanations, her lawyer confused by the contract's sudden reversal, her assistant reporting that Christopher Kane's office line had been disconnected and his company email was bouncing back as undeliverable. "What did you do to Christopher?" Rebecca asked, but she was afraid of the answer, afraid of how completely Daniel had dismantled her new life in the span of a single morning. "Christopher Kane received a promotion this morning," Daniel said, but the words carried no malice, just factual reporting of decisions already executed. "He's being transferred to our Jakarta office to manage operations in Southeast Asia. It's actually quite a prestigious position. He'll be overseeing approximately $40 billion in annual revenue. Of course, the position requires immediate relocation and complete focus on market development, so he'll have very little time for personal relationships. I'm sure he'll do excellent work there." Rebecca understood immediately. Christopher was being exiled, removed from her life as thoroughly as if he'd never existed, but in a way that appeared to be a professional opportunity rather than punishment. The sophistication of it was almost beautiful in its cruelty, but Rebecca was too devastated to appreciate the elegance of her husband's revenge. "And my company?" Rebecca whispered, but she already knew the answer would be catastrophic, could feel everything she'd built crumbling beneath her feet. Hart Creative Solutions owes Wright Global Enterprises approximately $47 million, Daniel explained, but he was reading from his phone now, delivering figures with accountant precision. "That includes the recalled contract payments, penalty fees for breach of agreement, and the outstanding loans I purchased from your previous creditors. You have 72 hours to arrange repayment, or we'll be forced to seize your assets and dissolve the company to recover our losses." Rebecca's vision blurred with tears, but she refused to let them fall, refused to give Daniel the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken, even though she felt like her entire world was disintegrating around her. Her company represented 7 years of brutal work, but it would be gone by the weekend, absorbed into the empire she'd married without knowing, destroyed by the man she'd loved without really seeing. "I can't pay $47 million, Rebecca said, but it was a statement of fact rather than a plea, an acknowledgement of her total defeat. "You know I can't. You've made sure of it." "I know," Daniel agreed, but there was no triumph in his voice, just exhaustion and disappointment. "Just like I know you're going to spend the next several years rebuilding from nothing, working for other people's companies because your reputation in this industry is about to become unsalvageable. Right Global will make sure every major firm knows about your contract breach, your poor judgment, your spectacular failure. You'll be lucky to get hired as a junior account manager somewhere that doesn't check references carefully." The vindictiveness of it should have made Rebecca angrier, but instead she felt something close to understanding. Daniel wasn't just punishing her for the affair or the divorce, but for 12 years of subtle contempt. 12 years of dismissing him as less than. 12 years of treating him like he was the lucky one in their marriage. The revenge was proportional to the insult, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked, but she was exhausted, defeated, her anger burned out by the sheer magnitude of her mistake. "Now you leave," Daniel said simply, but he gestured to the papers on the table. "I'll sign the divorce papers. You can have the house. It's paid off, worth about $2 million in today's market. That should give you something to start over with. Your personal bank accounts are untouched. I'm not trying to make you homeless or destitute, Rebecca. I'm just removing you from my life as completely as you tried to remove me from yours." Rebecca looked around the kitchen, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a museum of her own failure, every surface holding memories that had been recontextualized by Daniel's revelation. She thought about fighting, about lawyers and lawsuits and public battles, but she knew it was futile. You don't fight a trillion-dollar empire with anger and righteous indignation. You just survive it and hope to rebuild somewhere out of range. "I loved you," Rebecca said, but even as the words left her mouth, she wondered if they were true, if what she'd felt had actually been love or just comfortable companionship with someone who made her feel superior by comparison. "You loved the idea of me," Daniel corrected, but he wasn't being cruel now, just honest, giving Rebecca the truth she'd refused to see. "You loved having a husband who didn't challenge you, who made your success seem more impressive by contrast, who gave you someone to feel better than. But you never loved who I actually was, because you never bothered to find out. And when someone offered you something that looked better, you didn't even hesitate." The accuracy of it stung worse than any insult, but Rebecca couldn't deny it, couldn't defend against the truth she'd been avoiding since the first moment Christopher Kane had made her feel desired, important, seen in ways she'd convinced herself Daniel couldn't provide. She'd wanted to be special, but she'd been so busy looking for external validation that she'd missed the fact that she'd already married someone who could have given her everything she'd dreamed of. Daniel pulled out a pen and signed the divorce papers without ceremony, but his signature carried more weight than Rebecca had imagined possible. Daniel Alexander Wright, the name she'd shared for 12 years without understanding its significance, without knowing that it opened doors to rooms where global policy was decided, where fortunes were made and destroyed, where power moved in currents too vast for most people to comprehend. "There's one more thing," Daniel said as Rebecca gathered the papers with shaking hands, but his voice had softened slightly, taking on a quality that reminded her of the man she'd married, before ambition and betrayal had poisoned everything between them. I want you to know that this didn't make me happy. Destroying your company, ending your relationship with Christopher, watching you realize what you've lost, none of it felt good. It just felt necessary. Rebecca nodded, but she couldn't find words to respond, couldn't articulate the complex tangle of emotions churning through her chest. Grief for her marriage, shame for her choices, anger at Daniel's deception, and underneath it all, the devastating recognition that she'd gambled her life on a $33 million hand and lost everything because she'd never bothered to see the trillion-dollar fortune sitting across the table. 3 months later, Rebecca sat in a coffee shop in Portland, Oregon, but the 3,000 miles between her and New York felt like another universe, a different life where she'd been someone successful and ambitious rather than a cautionary tale whispered in business school case studies. She'd sold the Brooklyn brownstone for exactly $2 million, but after taxes and paying off her remaining personal debts, she'd cleared about $1.4 million, enough to live on if she was careful, enough to pretend she was fine, but nowhere near enough to recapture the future she'd destroyed. Hart Creative Solutions had dissolved within a week of Daniel's revelation, but the news hadn't been kind. Industry publications had covered her fall with the kind of gleeful schadenfreude reserved for those who'd climbed too high and fallen too spectacularly. The articles didn't mention Daniel's true identity or his role in her company's destruction, but they detailed her poor judgment, her breach of contract, her inability to maintain professional relationships, painting a picture of someone fundamentally unfit for leadership positions. Christopher Kane had sent her one email from Jakarta, but it had been brief, professional, offering apologies that felt rehearsed and explanations that revealed nothing about whether he'd known he was being used as a weapon in someone else's war. Rebecca had read it 17 times looking for subtext, but there was nothing there, just polite regret from a man who'd moved on to his prestigious new position and wasn't looking back at the wreckage he'd left behind. Rebecca's phone rang, but she didn't recognize the number, hesitating before answering with the caution of someone who'd learned that unexpected calls rarely brought good news. The voice on the other end was female, professional, identifying herself as Margaret Chen from Wright Global Enterprises legal department, and Rebecca's stomach dropped even as her curiosity sharpened. What could Daniel possibly want from her, now that he'd already taken everything? Ms. Hart, I'm calling to inform you about a trust that's been established in your name, Margaret said, but her tone suggested this was routine business rather than anything dramatic. Mr. Wright has deposited $50 million into an account that will become accessible to you in exactly 10 years, provided you meet certain conditions. Rebecca's breath caught, but she forced herself to listen rather than interrupt, to understand what new game Daniel was playing, what trap this money represented. Margaret continued without waiting for response, reading from what sounded like a prepared statement, outlining conditions that were simultaneously generous and insulting. The conditions are as follows, Margaret explained, but her voice remained neutral, suggesting she'd delivered this kind of message before. You cannot work in marketing, advertising, or any related field during the 10-year period. You cannot attempt to contact Mr. Wright, his associates, or any employees of Wright Global Enterprises. You must maintain employment in a field unrelated to your previous career. You must complete 1 year of counseling focused on personal growth and relationship patterns, and you must agree to share your story publicly if requested, serving as a case study in business ethics courses at 3 universities of Mr. Wright's choosing. The conditions were humiliating, but they were also survivable. 10 years of exile in exchange for $50 million and the chance to rebuild a life, to become someone other than the woman who'd thrown away a $1 trillion marriage for the illusion of something better. Rebecca closed her eyes, but she saw Daniel's face as it had looked that morning in their kitchen, saw the sadness beneath his anger, the hurt beneath his calculated revenge. Why is he doing this? Rebecca asked, but she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Wasn't sure she could handle more revelations about the man she'd thought she'd known. Mr. Wright instructed me to tell you that everyone deserves a second chance, Margaret replied, but now there was something in her voice that suggested personal opinion rather than scripted message. He believes you're capable of growth, of becoming someone who values people over opportunities. He's giving you 10 years to prove him right. What you do with that time is entirely up to you. The call ended, but Rebecca sat in the coffee shop for another hour, watching people pass on the street outside, ordinary people living ordinary lives without trillion-dollar fortunes or spectacular failures haunting their every decision. She thought about the next 10 years, but for the first time since that morning in her kitchen, she felt something other than devastation. She felt possibility, the strange gift of forced transformation, the chance to rebuild herself into someone who might actually deserve a second chance. Daniel Wright stood in his office 97 floors above Manhattan, but he wasn't thinking about his empire or his investments or the countless decisions that required his attention. He was thinking about the woman he'd loved and lost, wondering if 10 years would be enough time for her to understand what she'd thrown away, what she'd missed by looking at him without seeing him. The divorce papers sat in a frame on his desk, but they weren't displayed as a trophy. They were a reminder that even unlimited resources couldn't buy genuine connection, that all the money in the world couldn't replace the simple human need to be known and valued for who you actually were. The revenge had been satisfying in the moment, but 3 months later it just felt empty. Another transaction completed, another negotiation won, another victory that changed nothing about the fundamental loneliness Daniel had been trying to escape since his grandfather first explained that wealth would always corrupt every relationship, every interaction, every attempt at authentic human connection. Rebecca had proven the old man right, but Daniel found no comfort in that confirmation, just the bitter knowledge that his experiment had failed, that love couldn't survive prosperity's test, that the question he'd spent 12 years trying to answer had finally been resolved in the worst possible way. Years from now, Rebecca would stand in front of a lecture hall full of business students, but she wouldn't be teaching them about marketing strategies or brand development. She'd be telling them about the $33 million deal that cost her everything, about the husband she'd dismissed without ever really knowing, about the trillion-dollar empire she'd married and divorced without understanding what she'd lost. The students would listen with the smug certainty of young people who believed they'd never make such obvious mistakes. But some of them would remember her story years later, when their own ambitions blinded them to the value of what they already had. The newspapers never reported that Daniel Wright had been married, but his employees whispered about it sometimes, speculating about the guest room office that had sat empty for 12 years, about the boss who'd lived a double life without anyone noticing, about the wife who'd divorced $1 trillion because she thought she'd found something better. The story became legend within the company, but it was always told with uncertainty about whether it was inspiring or tragic, whether Daniel's test proved something profound about human nature or just demonstrated that trust destroyed is impossible to rebuild. Christopher Kane built a successful career in Jakarta, but he never married, never committed to relationships that lasted longer than a few months, carrying the knowledge that he'd been used as a weapon in someone else's war, without ever understanding the full scope of what he'd destroyed. Sometimes he thought about Rebecca, but mostly he tried not to, tried to focus on his work and his accomplishments and the prestigious position he'd earned through skills he now questioned were actually his own. Rebecca did complete the counseling, but it took 3 attempts before she found a therapist who could help her understand what had driven her to prioritize ambition over connection, to value achievement over loyalty, to see her husband as an obstacle rather than a partner. The work was painful, but it was necessary. 10 years felt like enough time to become someone different, someone who might actually deserve the second chance Daniel had given her, someone who would never again mistake a person's circumstances for their character. The $50 million sat in its trust account, but Rebecca rarely thought about it during those 10 years. She was too busy rebuilding her life as a high school teacher, working with teenagers who reminded her of her younger self, ambitious and certain and completely unaware of how much they didn't yet understand about what actually mattered. Teaching didn't pay well, but it satisfied something deeper than her marketing career ever had. Gave her purpose that wasn't tied to contracts or commissions or the validation of people who only cared about what she could do for them. On the day the trust became accessible, Rebecca sat in her modest apartment in Portland and stared at the bank transfer notification, but she didn't feel the excitement she'd expected. She felt sad, grateful, and impossibly distant from the woman who'd signed that $33 million contract, believing it would change her life. The money would let her retire early if she wanted, but she realized she didn't want to, realized that teaching had given her something Daniel's forced exile had been designed to create, a sense of worth that wasn't tied to wealth or status or the admiration of people who didn't really know her. Daniel never remarried, but he didn't remain isolated either. He dated occasionally, women who knew his identity from the start, who accepted that relationship with him meant relationship with his empire, but none of those connections felt real, genuine, the kind of love he'd hoped to find when he'd first approached Rebecca at that charity fundraiser 12 years and a lifetime ago. He'd proven his grandfather wrong about one thing, though. Wealth didn't have to destroy every relationship, but it did make finding authentic connection exponentially harder, made every interaction suspect, made trust nearly impossible to establish and even harder to maintain. The case study became standard reading in business ethics courses at Harvard, Wharton, and Stanford, but the students who read it never learned the real names, never knew that the $33 million deal and the trillion-dollar empire were real rather than hypothetical. They debated whether Daniel's test was ethical, whether Rebecca's choice was understandable, whether Christopher's role was forgivable, arguing passionately about abstract principles while missing the fundamental truth the story was designed to teach. That character is revealed in moments of temptation, that loyalty cannot be bought or tested, but only given freely, and that sometimes the biggest opportunities come disguised as disasters, while the greatest losses appear as triumphs. 20 years after that morning in the Brooklyn kitchen, Rebecca received an invitation to a charity fundraiser in Manhattan, but the invitation didn't come from Daniel. It came from the foundation his grandfather had established, requesting her presence as a keynote speaker about second chances and personal transformation. Rebecca accepted, but her hands trembled as she wrote the response, knowing that speaking at the event meant possibly seeing Daniel again, possibly having to face the man she'd betrayed with the person she'd become since that betrayal. The night of the fundraiser, Rebecca stood at the same venue where she'd first met Daniel all those years ago, but everything was different now. She was different, older, changed by 10 years of forced reflection and authentic work, carrying $50 million she'd never expected to receive and wisdom she'd paid for with everything she'd lost. She delivered her speech without notes, telling her story with the kind of honesty that only comes from having truly learned from catastrophic mistakes. And when she finished, the room was silent for 3 full seconds before erupting in applause that felt less like approval and more like recognition of shared human failure. Daniel Wright sat in the back row, but Rebecca didn't see him until after her speech, didn't notice him standing apart from the crowd until she was leaving the stage, and their eyes met across the room. Time had changed him too. More gray in his hair, more lines around his eyes, but the same careful intelligence in his gaze, the same ability to see through surfaces to the truth underneath. They didn't speak that night, but Rebecca received an email the next morning, brief like Christopher's message from Jakarta years ago, but carrying completely different weight. different possibility. Daniel wrote that her speech had been powerful, that she'd clearly done the work he'd hoped she'd do, that he was genuinely proud of who she'd become, but the email ended with a sentence that made Rebecca's heart race, even as her mind urged caution. "I'd like to buy you coffee sometime," Daniel had written, but there was no pressure in the invitation, no expectation, just genuine interest in reconnecting with someone he'd once loved, once tested, once pushed away because the pain of betrayal had been too fresh to imagine anything else. Not as your ex-husband or as the man whose empire you divorced, but as someone who'd genuinely like to know who Rebecca Hart has become. If you're interested, you know where to find me. Rebecca stared at the email for 3 days before responding, but when she finally did, her answer was simple, honest, and completely uncertain about what it might lead to. She said yes. She'd have coffee. She'd like to know who Daniel Wright had become too. But she made no promises beyond that single meeting, refused to let hope override the hard-won wisdom that had cost her everything to acquire. Their coffee meeting lasted 4 hours, but it wasn't romantic or dramatic or anything that suggested they might rebuild what had been destroyed. It was two people with enormous shared history, trying to understand if friendship was possible after betrayal, if forgiveness could exist without forgetting, if second chances applied to relationships, as well as individual transformation. They talked about the past but didn't dwell on it, acknowledged the hurt but didn't weaponize it, explored whether the people they'd become could build something new without being haunted by who they'd been. The ending wasn't dramatic because real life rarely is. Rebecca and Daniel didn't remarry, didn't fall back into passionate reunion, didn't erase the years of damage with convenient reconciliation. Instead, they built something smaller but more authentic. A friendship based on genuine knowledge of each other, on acceptance of past mistakes, on the recognition that sometimes the most important thing two people can do is acknowledge that they both deserved better than what they'd given each other the first time around. Rebecca used her $50 million to start a foundation focused on business education for underprivileged students, but she didn't run it as a CEO. She taught classes herself, mentored teenagers who reminded her of her younger self, tried to help them understand that success wasn't just about ambition, but about character, about valuing people over opportunities, about recognizing that sometimes the biggest wealth sits across your breakfast table every morning, wearing an ordinary face. Daniel continued running his empire, but he did it with more transparency, ending the double life that had defined his marriage to Rebecca, accepting that if genuine connection required his identity to be known up front, then that was the price of authenticity, the cost of finding someone who might love both the man and the empire without being corrupted by either. 25 years after Rebecca Hart signed the $33 million contract that destroyed her life, she stood in the lobby of Wright Global Enterprises for the first time as an invited guest rather than an unknowing wife. But the building felt different now, less intimidating, more human, a place where decisions happened rather than a temple of wealth she'd never understood existed. The security guard checked her credentials with professional courtesy, but he didn't know he was greeting the woman whose story had become corporate legend, the cautionary tale that every new executive at Wright Global learned during their orientation about the dangers of underestimating the quiet people in your life. Daniel had invited her to attend the dedication ceremony for the Right Heart Educational Initiative, but Rebecca had initially refused, uncomfortable with having her name attached to Daniel's empire even after all these years of careful friendship, reluctant to let their shared history become public in ways that would invite speculation and judgment. Daniel had persisted, though, and eventually Rebecca understood why. The initiative wasn't about her redemption or his forgiveness, but about transforming their mutual failure into something that might prevent others from making the same mistakes, might help young people understand that character mattered more than opportunity. That loyalty was more valuable than advancement, that sometimes the person you dismiss as unremarkable is actually the most remarkable person you'll ever meet. The ceremony was held in the building's atrium, but it wasn't the formal corporate event Rebecca had expected. Instead, it was intimate, personal, attended by 50 high school students who'd received scholarships from the foundation Rebecca had built with her second chance money, students whose lives were being changed by resources that had originated in betrayal and grown through transformation. Rebecca watched these teenagers mingle with Daniel's executives, but she felt something close to peace, acceptance that the worst moment of her life had eventually produced something genuinely good, that redemption was possible even when you couldn't undo the damage you'd caused. Daniel approached as Rebecca stood alone near the floor-to-ceiling windows, but his walk was slower than she remembered, his shoulders carrying the weight of 73 years and the burden of an empire he'd never asked for but managed with unwavering dedication. They'd seen each other perhaps 30 times in the past 25 years, but always in neutral spaces, coffee shops, public parks, charity events, never in the building that represented everything Rebecca had married without knowing, divorced without understanding, and spent decades learning to see differently. "Thank you for coming," Daniel said, but there was genuine gratitude in his voice rather than social courtesy, real appreciation that Rebecca had overcome her discomfort to support something they'd built together from the wreckage of their marriage. "I know this building holds difficult memories." Rebecca smiled, but it was tinged with the kind of sadness that never completely fades, the permanent mark that profound mistakes leave on even the most healed hearts. She'd remarried 7 years ago to a high school principal named Thomas Brennan, but her second marriage was nothing like her first. Thomas knew everything about her past, about her failures, about the $33 million deal and the $1 trillion mistake, and he'd chosen her anyway, chosen her because of who she'd become rather than despite who she'd been. "The memories aren't as painful as they used to be," Rebecca replied. But she was looking at the students rather than at Daniel, watching them laugh and dream and plan futures they believed they controlled. Mostly they just feel distant now, like they happened to someone else. "I suppose in a way they did. I'm not that person anymore." Daniel nodded, but he understood exactly what she meant. Had spent his own decades transforming from the hurt young man who'd orchestrated elaborate revenge into someone who could view their shared history with perspective rather than pain, who could stand beside his ex-wife without anger or regret, just acceptance of what had been and gratitude for what had grown from the ashes. "I've been thinking about Christopher lately," Daniel admitted, but this was the first time he'd mentioned their mutual ghost in perhaps a decade, the man who'd been weaponized in their war without ever knowing he was ammunition. He retired last year, 59 years old, never married, spent 30 years running our Southeast Asian operations with remarkable efficiency. I sent him a retirement gift, $10 million and a letter explaining what had actually happened all those years ago. Rebecca's eyes widened, but she wasn't sure if she felt sympathy for Christopher or relief that he'd finally been told the truth. Finally understood that his role in their story had been scripted rather than chosen. She'd thought about reaching out to him over the years, but what would she say? How do you apologize to someone for being used as an instrument of your punishment without making it sound like you were the victim when really you'd been the architect of your own destruction? "How did he respond?" Rebecca asked, but she was almost afraid of the answer. Afraid that Christopher's pain would reopen wounds she'd worked hard to close. "He sent back a one-sentence email," Daniel said, but there was something like admiration in his tone, despite the brevity of Christopher's response. He wrote, "I forgive you both, but I don't want the money. Give it to someone who hasn't spent 30 years running from the consequences of other people's choices." The sentence landed between them with the weight of earned wisdom, but Rebecca understood immediately what Christopher meant. He'd been a victim of their dysfunction caught in the crossfire of a marriage that had been doomed by deception and destroyed by ambition, but he'd chosen to spend 3 decades in exile rather than confronting what had been done to him, rather than demanding answers or seeking his own form of justice. The $10 million couldn't buy back the life he might have lived if Daniel hadn't used him as a test and Rebecca hadn't failed it. "Did you give the money away?" Rebecca asked, but she already knew Daniel's answer, could read it in the slight smile that crossed his face, the look of someone who'd finally learned to transform pain into purpose. "I used it to fund 50 additional scholarships," Daniel confirmed, but he gestured to the students filling the atrium. Young people who had no idea their education was being paid for by a man they'd never meet, funded by guilt and regret and the hope that maybe their success could balance out the damage 3 adults had inflicted on each other decades ago. Christopher never knew it, but he spent 30 years making me billions of dollars. The least I could do was make sure his involuntary sacrifice produced something meaningful. Rebecca watched a young girl, perhaps 17, wearing a scholarship program t-shirt and carrying dreams that probably looked a lot like Rebecca's had at that age, laugh at something her friend said, but Rebecca felt the familiar ache of recognition, the knowledge that this girl would make her own mistakes, face her own temptations, discover her own capacity for both loyalty and betrayal. The best Rebecca could do was tell her story honestly, teach these students that ambition without character led nowhere worth going, that opportunities could be traps disguised as triumphs, that the quiet people you dismiss might be the ones who change your life forever. The dedication ceremony began, but Rebecca found herself standing next to Daniel, rather than sitting with the audience, united in their role as cautionary tales who'd somehow become mentors, as people who'd failed spectacularly but learned profoundly, as ex-spouses who'd destroyed each other and then rebuilt something honest from the ruins. The foundation's director, a brilliant woman named Patricia Rodriguez who'd grown up in poverty and now held a doctorate in education, spoke about opportunity and transformation, but she didn't mention Rebecca and Daniel's history, didn't explain that every dollar funding these scholarships originated in betrayal and revenge. After the ceremony, one of the students approached Rebecca, but the girl's question was unexpected, disarming in its directness. "Ms. Hart, is it true you used to be married to Mr. Wright?" Rebecca glanced at Daniel, but he simply nodded, giving her permission to answer however she felt appropriate, to share as much or as little of their story as she thought this young woman needed to hear. Rebecca took a breath, but she decided on honesty, the same brutal self-examination that had defined her past 25 years. "Yes, I was married to Mr. Wright for 12 years, Rebecca confirmed, but she met the girl's eyes directly, refusing to hide from the judgment that might follow. "And I divorced him because I thought I'd found something better, someone who appreciated my ambition more than he did. I was wrong, spectacularly, devastatingly wrong, in ways that cost me my career, my reputation, and nearly destroyed any chance I had at becoming someone I could respect." The girl processed this information, but her next question revealed she'd already heard some version of their story, already knew the broad strokes, even if she didn't know the specific details. "Is it true he was a billionaire the whole time and you didn't know?" "Trillionaire, actually," Rebecca corrected, but she said it with the weary amusement of someone who'd long ago stopped being impressed by numbers that vast, who'd learned that wealth without wisdom was just another form of poverty. "And yes, I didn't know. He wanted to find out if I could love him without knowing about his money. I failed that test, and it taught me more about my own character than any success ever could have." The girl seemed satisfied with this answer, but before she walked away, she said something that made Rebecca's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Thank you for being honest about failing. Most adults just tell us about their successes and pretend they never made mistakes. It's nice to hear from someone who screwed up and survived." After the students left and the atrium emptied, Rebecca and Daniel stood alone among the flowers and banners, celebrating the initiative that bore both their names. But the silence between them was comfortable now. The ease of two people who'd seen each other at their absolute worst and somehow found their way to mutual respect, if not complete forgiveness. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd told me the truth from the beginning?" Rebecca asked. But it wasn't an accusation, just genuine curiosity about the alternative timeline that had never existed, the marriage that might have been if Daniel had trusted her with his identity instead of testing her loyalty through deception. "Every day for the first 10 years, Daniel admitted, but his honesty matched hers, refusing to pretend the past didn't matter or that his choices hadn't contributed to their mutual destruction. "But I've made peace with it now. If I'd told you from the start, I never would have known whether you loved me or the Empire. The test was cruel, but it answered a question I needed answered, even if I didn't like the result." Rebecca nodded, but she had her own confession, her own alternate history that haunted quiet moments. "And I wonder what would have happened if I'd valued loyalty over opportunity, if I'd recognized that the man I lived with mattered more than the deal I was chasing. But I can't change the past. I can only try to help these kids avoid making the same mistakes I did." They stood together watching the sun set through the massive windows, but both of them were thinking about the same thing, the morning 25 years ago when everything had fallen apart, when a $33 million deal had revealed the fault lines in their marriage, when a $1 trillion empire had crushed the woman who'd never known she'd married into it. That morning had defined both their lives, but it hadn't destroyed them, and perhaps that was its own kind of triumph, the knowledge that catastrophic failure didn't have to be permanent, that people could grow from their worst moments, that redemption was possible even when forgiveness was incomplete. "I should go," Rebecca said finally, but she turned to face Daniel directly, seeing him clearly in ways she never had during their marriage, not as the disappointing husband or the vengeful billionaire or the wounded man orchestrating her destruction, but as a human being who'd been hurt and had hurt her in return, who'd spent decades learning the same lessons about character and consequence that she'd learned, who'd transformed his pain into purpose just as she had. "Thomas is cooking dinner and I promised I'd be home by 7. "How is Thomas?" Daniel asked, but there was genuine warmth in the question, no jealousy or resentment toward the man who'd gotten the version of Rebecca that Daniel had tried and failed to find. "He's good," Rebecca replied, and her smile was unguarded now, the expression of someone who'd finally found the kind of love that didn't require tests or deception, that existed in simple everyday moments rather than grand gestures and dramatic revelations. "We're actually thinking about fostering teenagers, kids who've aged out of the system and need a stable place while they figure out college or careers. Thomas thinks my particular brand of hard-won wisdom might be useful for kids who feel like they've already made too many mistakes to recover from." Daniel smiled at that, but it was tinged with melancholy, the recognition that Rebecca had built the kind of life he'd always wanted, but never quite managed to find. Partnership, purpose, peace with the past, rather than constant vigilance about the future. He'd dated over the years, had even come close to proposing once to a woman who'd loved him knowing exactly who he was, but something had always held him back, some part of him still wounded by the revelation that 12 years of careful love could be discarded the moment something shinier appeared. "That sounds perfect for you," Daniel said, but he meant it sincerely, genuinely happy that Rebecca had found happiness, even if he remained alone with his empire and his memories and his annual charity galas, where people admired his wealth without ever really seeing him. "Tell Thomas he's a lucky man." "I will," Rebecca promised, but then she did something unexpected. She stepped forward and hugged Daniel briefly, the first physical contact they'd had in perhaps 15 years, a gesture that acknowledged their shared history without romanticizing it. That said, forgiveness was possible even when reconciliation wasn't. And Daniel, thank you. Not just for the scholarship money or the second chance, but for caring enough to teach me something I desperately needed to learn, even if the lesson was brutal. I'm a better person because of what happened between us, and I know that's a strange thing to be grateful for, but I am. Daniel returned the hug carefully, but he felt something. Release in his chest. Some burden he'd been carrying for 25 years finally lifting. Not completely. Never completely, but enough that he could breathe a little easier. Could imagine that maybe the test he'd administered and the revenge he'd orchestrated hadn't just been cruelty disguised as justice, but actually had served some higher purpose, had transformed two broken people into two better people, even if they'd had to destroy each other first to make that transformation possible. Rebecca left the building as the sun painted Manhattan gold and orange, but she paused on the sidewalk to look back at the tower that had once represented everything she'd wanted and everything she'd lost. Wright Global Enterprises rose 97 stories into the evening sky, but it looked different to her now, not as a monument to wealth she'd never understood, or a prison where her ex-husband plotted revenge, but simply as a building where work happened, where decisions were made, where one man carried the burden of an empire he'd never asked for, but managed with integrity that had taken her 12 years to recognize. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas asking if she wanted him to wait on dinner, but Rebecca smiled and replied that she was on her way, that she'd been delayed by memories but was heading home now, that she loved him and appreciated his patience with her occasional trips into the past. She caught a cab heading toward Brooklyn, but as the city lights flickered past her window, Rebecca thought about the girl who'd asked her about failure, about the students whose educations were being funded by mistakes they'd never know about the possibility that maybe the most important thing she'd done with her life wasn't the companies she'd built or the contracts she'd signed, but simply the honesty she'd offered about how badly she'd failed and how hard she'd worked to become someone better. Back in his office on the 97th floor, Daniel stood at his desk looking at the framed divorce papers that had sat there for 25 years. But tonight he finally took them down from the wall, carefully removed them from the frame, and filed them away in a drawer where he kept other important documents from his past. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but no longer the centerpiece of his daily existence, no longer the first thing he saw every morning and the last thing he considered every night. In their place, Daniel hung a photograph from that day's ceremony, Rebecca standing with the scholarship students, her face showing the kind of genuine joy that came from purpose rather than achievement, from giving rather than taking, from knowing she was making a difference in ways that had nothing to do with $33 million contracts or trillion-dollar empires. Daniel had taken the photo himself, capturing the moment when one of the students had hugged Rebecca in gratitude, when his ex-wife's face had shown the kind of peace that came from forgiveness, not from him, but from herself, from finally accepting that who she'd been didn't have to define who she'd become. The phone on Daniel's desk rang with the distinctive tone that meant an emergency at one of their overseas facilities, but Daniel answered with the practiced calm of someone who'd spent 5 decades managing crises, solving problems, making decisions that affected millions of people who'd never know his name. The call lasted 40 minutes, but when it ended, Daniel looked out at the city he'd helped build through investments and developments and projects that bore other people's names, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Contentment, acceptance, the recognition that maybe his grandfather had been wrong after all. Wealth had corrupted his marriage, but it hadn't destroyed him, and more importantly, it had eventually funded the transformation of someone who'd betrayed him, had given Rebecca the resources and time to become someone genuinely worthy of the second chance he'd offered. That had to count for something, had to mean that money wasn't inherently corrupting but simply revealed what was already there, Ambition, loyalty, character, weakness, everything that made humans beautifully flawed and capable of both tremendous damage and remarkable growth. Daniel drafted an email to his board of directors, but it was brief, shocking in its implications. He was retiring in 2 years, stepping down from active management of Wright Global Enterprises to focus on philanthropy, on transforming the empire his grandfather built into something that served more than just shareholders and quarterly earnings reports. The announcement would send shockwaves through the business world, but Daniel was 73 years old and tired of carrying weight that had never been meant for one person to bear alone. The succession plan was already in place. A brilliant woman named Jennifer Wu, who'd risen through the ranks based on merit rather than connections, who knew Daniel's identity and had chosen to work for him anyway, who represented the kind of leadership that valued people over profits, without sacrificing the competence necessary to manage a trillion-dollar enterprise. Jennifer would do well, Daniel thought, would transform the company in ways he'd never imagined, would prove that his life's work could outlast his personal failures and become something that genuinely made the world better. 3,000 miles away, Rebecca walked into her modest house in Portland, but Thomas met her at the door with the kind of kiss that spoke of 15 years of steady partnership, of love that didn't require tests or drama or spectacular gestures, just daily choice to see each other clearly and choose each other anyway. They ate dinner talking about their potential foster children, but the conversation was excited, hopeful, full of the kind of purpose that made Rebecca grateful for every lesson she'd learned the hard way, every mistake that had brought her to this moment where she finally understood what actually mattered. "You seem peaceful tonight," Thomas observed, but he knew her well enough to recognize that she'd been carrying tension about the ceremony, about seeing Daniel, about having their history made semi-public through the foundation that bore both their names. "How was it?" "It was good," Rebecca said, and she meant it, could say it without reservation or lingering pain. "Really good. I think we've finally figured out how to transform something broken into something useful. It only took us 25 years. Thomas laughed, but it was gentle, understanding, the sound of someone who'd made his own mistakes and appreciated that wisdom came slowly, painfully, through failures that taught lessons success never could. They cleaned up dinner together, moving through their kitchen with the comfortable synchronization of long partnership. And Rebecca thought about the morning 25 years ago when she'd stood in a different kitchen, throwing away a wedding ring and a marriage without understanding what either actually represented. She didn't regret divorcing Daniel. Staying in a marriage built on deception would have been its own kind of betrayal, its own failure of integrity. But she regretted the person she'd been, the choices she'd made, the values she'd prioritized. The $33 million deal had seemed like her salvation, but it had actually been her reckoning, the moment when her character was tested and found wanting, when ambition revealed itself as a poor substitute for loyalty, when she learned that success without integrity was just another form of failure. But she'd learned, had grown, had become someone who could stand in front of students and say, "I failed spectacularly, and here's what it taught me." And that honesty felt more valuable than any contract she'd ever signed, more important than any business she'd built, more meaningful than any achievement that looked impressive on paper, but had required her to compromise who she wanted to be. Years later, when Rebecca Hart died at 87, surrounded by the foster children who'd become her family and the students she'd mentored into successful careers, her obituary mentioned the foundation but not the scandal, celebrated her transformation but not the betrayal that had necessitated it. Daniel Wright attended her funeral, but he sat in the back row, just another mourner among hundreds of people whose lives Rebecca had touched. And when people asked how he'd known her, he simply said, "We were friends," because it was true. They had been friends, eventually, after everything else had burned away. Daniel lived another 6 years after Rebecca's death, But his final act was to ensure that the Right Heart Educational Initiative would continue in perpetuity, funded by a trust so vast that it could provide scholarships for thousands of students every year, transforming one couple's spectacular failure into generations of opportunity for young people who needed to know that mistakes weren't permanent, that character could be rebuilt, that second chances were possible even after the worst betrayals. The story never went viral because the principals refused to name themselves publicly, but it lived in business school case studies and late-night conversations, and the cautionary tales parents told their ambitious children about the dangers of valuing achievement over character, opportunity over loyalty, success over integrity. The details changed in each retelling, sometimes 33 million, sometimes 40, sometimes the marriage lasted 10 years or 15 or 20, but the core truth remained constant. His wife got a $33 million business deal and threw him out to marry her lover, unaware he owned the trillion-dollar company that signed the deal. What he did shocked her and left her ruined. But the story didn't end with her ruin, because real life rarely follows the clean narrative arcs of fiction, rarely delivers perfect justice or complete redemption, rarely offers the satisfaction of seeing villains punished and heroes rewarded. Instead, life offered something messier, but more honest. Two people who'd failed each other spectacularly but learned profoundly, who'd destroyed their marriage but saved their souls, who'd lost everything that looked valuable but found everything that actually mattered. And in the end, perhaps that was the real lesson. Not that betrayal deserves punishment or that tests reveal character, but that humans are capable of both terrible mistakes and remarkable growth. That the worst moments of our lives can become the foundation for our best selves. And that sometimes the most important thing we can do is fail honestly, learn thoroughly, and transform completely into people who might actually deserve the second chances we're given. The Right Heart Foundation continues its work, but if you visit their headquarters, you'll find only a small plaque explaining the names. No dramatic story, no scandal revealed, just a simple statement that two people who'd once been married had chosen to transform their failure into something that might help others avoid making the same mistakes. Students receive scholarships without knowing they're funded by betrayal and revenge and eventual forgiveness, without understanding that every dollar they receive represents hard-won wisdom about character and consequence and the long, difficult road from catastrophic failure to earned redemption. And maybe that's exactly how it should be. The past serving the future without the future having to carry the weight of every mistake that made their opportunities possible. Second chances given by people who'd needed them desperately and received them graciously. Transformation funded by the knowledge that even trillion-dollar fortunes can't buy back time, but they can shape tomorrow into something better than yesterday ever was. The story ends not with triumph or tragedy, but with acceptance. Acceptance that love can fail without destroying the people who loved, that betrayal can teach without permanently damaging, that revenge can transform into purpose, that ex-spouses can become allies, that mistakes can become wisdom, and that sometimes the most important thing two people can do for each other is survive their mutual destruction and build something meaningful from the ruins they created together.